Okay, so welcome to this Wednesday night workshop. We're, I think, at number 6 now of the reading sessions, where we're slowly making our way through the grand Gestalt and little Gestalts within Gestalts, composed by the late great Lyndon LaRouche in 2002. For those who don't know, Gestalt is just a fancy German term for thought object, idea, or an idea which is more than the sum of its parts. I think that's the technical Gestalt definition, is a whole unified idea concept, which is more than the sum of its parts, more than the words used to express that idea. So like any piece of art, whether a poem with many strophes, or whether a symphony with many musical movements, you have little, each strophe, each movement could be appreciated as a standalone, but it really doesn't have full meaning unless you look at the whole composition in which it exists. So I think you could think of a good article, a good essay in an artistic way, in a similar way. And we've been looking through different movements so far of ideas that in previous weeks took on the concept of entropy versus anti-entropy, the importance of the two concepts as far as it concerns living and thinking states of existence, living being the biosphere, thinking being the human economy, which also includes the biosphere. Last week we had a whole section on ambiguity as truth, which is a very non-intuitive but very truthful way of thinking about the best way of conceiving of truth, which can't really ever be fully crystallized as a closed definition, because as soon as you try to do that, you don't really give any space for the mind to improve upon your understanding of whatever it is you're trying to get your mind around or express, right? So you should always have, like in the case of the great US experience, the founding documents, a system which is more perfect, which is always has the seeds of its own renewal and perfectibility embedded within it, right? So that you're giving the mind enough to be both satisfied, but also hungry enough to go beyond where it's at. And I think that if those two conditions are met, we generally have something which is healthy. It's not perfect, and it should never be perfect, because then you can't get more perfect than perfect. So, you always want to have space to improve. So that was a fun discussion. Unfortunately, as I was saying before I hit record, the technical glitches on my side were so bad that I don't think we can make the recording available. So that's sad. People should just read, though, the section that says ambiguity is truth. That's going to be linked in the description box of this video. And today we're going to get back into a little bit more of the conventional economic concepts that we began with, especially dealing with concepts of free trade versus protectionism, and what the historic American system was premised around. Maybe not in all of its detail, but at least in the most important components of its spirit and principle. So I'm just going to do a little bit of a screen share. And like usual, we'll probably just do one reader. I think that's been working pretty well so far. Maybe two. We'll see if somebody gets tired. Who would? Well, first of all, before we read, is there any thoughts from previous weeks that people feel I should have maybe emphasized for people listening on YouTube, or those who are just joining us, or did I do an okay job at setting the stage for what we're about to do? For those who are here. Was that Paul?
It's all fine.
Okay, Paul approves. Good. All right, I passed. All right.
Paul approves too.
All right, good. Thanks. Good. So for today, who wants to be the reader under free trade as colonialism?
I'll read some.
You got a warm, buttery reading voice, Bruce. I'm very happy. That's great. Go for it. Oh, you want me to make it bigger? I can make it bigger too.
Yeah, Tad, please.
How's that?
That's very nice. Right. Wait a minute. Starting with where we're at free trade as colonialism?
Yeah, that's the one.
All right, I'm ready. Free trade as colonialism. Take a typical economics example of such ambiguities. Take a factory from the USA, move it to a nation in Asia, where labor is said to be cheaper and so forth. In this case, it has been wrongly assumed among those who do not understand economics that that sort of outsourcing will increase the profitability and growth rates of the world economy. The latter foolish belief has been the leading feature of the argument in favor of the deadly pandemic disease known as globalization. For a comparable case, examine Henry C. Carey's book on the slave trade. The person ignorant of the ABCs of economics tends to believe that the U.S. economy as a whole profited from slave labor. Carey demonstrates that while the British monarchy and some Americans were enriched individually by the traffic in the products of slave labor, the U.S. economy as a whole suffered a massive economic loss as a result of the looting generated as the effects of slavery. The surge of the U.S. economy to great power status during 1861 to 1876 was a result of liberating the nation from these inherent effects of slavery. Compare the case of the transfer of a manufacturing unit to Asia from the standpoint of Carey's study of the effects of slavery on the U.S. economy.
Just quick, was there a good footnote for 44? I don't know if there's I could just check actually. Okay, it's just a reference to Henry C. Carey's Slave Trade, Foreign and Domestic, which is a great read.
Good. Comparing that, should we encourage the promoting of modern manufacturing in Asian nations? Yes, without a doubt. The benefits of raising the productive powers of labor there for the consumption of the internal economy should be obvious. Should we therefore substitute cheap labor production in Asia as a source on which the United States depends for its products? It would be folly to do so, and of no benefit either to Asia or in the end, the USA either. This is true by the nature of the interdependency among what I define as the economy's political, social, and economic characteristics. This use of characteristic is adapted from Bernhard Reinmann's definition of that term as a term of a physical form of differential geometry. A national economy is not the sum total of its independently defined component parts, such as individual firms. It cannot be competently represented as a Euclidean geometry does, as a mere statistical description of observed motions among events. Rather, it represents a more or less inseparable sort of functional interdependence among the dependency among the totality of its principal such components, the reciprocal interaction of the whole. In other words, if two identical productive facilities with identical designs of products and so on are situated in different national economies, the contribution of the average productive powers of labor, meeting identical specifications for employment, will vary according to the characteristic relative productivity of each economy as a whole. The difference will be of the significance of a difference in attributable physical economic curvature of the space-time represented by the representative economy. I'm reading that sentence again.
Yeah, do it.
The difference will be of the significance of a difference in attributable physical economic curvature of the space-time represented by the respective economy. For example, the proposal that developing nations rely on tourism rather than building up basic economic infrastructure is among the most efficient ways of ensuring that such a nation prevents itself from developing successfully up to modern standards of productivity per capita.
All right, so I'm going to just stop you right there. There's a lot of meaty stuff here, and I want everybody to know that if you feel an urge to ask a question, just crash right into it anytime and just ask a question. There's no such thing as a bad question. Well, there are bad questions, that's true. Don't get me wrong, but in this case, probably not a bad. If it's an honest question, it's a good question. In previous reading sessions, I know not everybody is here for every single session. He did develop these very important concepts in other ways, which didn't appear to have a direct connection to economics as it is conventionally taught, right? Concepts of money, inflation, pricing. He spent a lot of time discussing science and the battles within the histories of so-called Western science between creative movements of figures who revolutionized our understanding of physical space-time versus the oligarchical pseudoscientists who are often trumpeted as the great heroes of Western thought, who have fruit that falls in their head and then they make discoveries of universal principle, you know. And he went through a little bit of how this pseudoscience has convinced or duped many people to think that that's the only Western science, that there's only one. And he spent his time doing this by really harping on this question of curvature and how you have in the universe no such thing as a straight line. So in the physical reality that we're born into, as hard as we might wish to try, there's no example of a straight linear line that can ever be created, even with the best lasers. Doesn't exist. We find, and the more we refine our understanding, the more we realize the subtle curvature of physical space time. The problem is that we can imagine a straight line in our minds. We can have this abstract perfect square in our minds, right? And it's useful that we can imagine perfect triangles and squares and pentagons and spheres that are perfectly round, but it's useful, but it's not. If we try to use that naive abstraction as a mapping when we want to figure out the real universe, it doesn't work. It breaks down. And so it's a guide, but we can't rely on it like a crutch. So going back to the ancients of ancient Greece, who are looking at conic sections, who are looking at a lot of things like I mean, he went through a lot of examples, and throughout the Renaissance process, those who are looking at the physical curves were the ones who were making the discoveries into the calculus, into differential geometries, infinitesimal calculus. And this is involving things like, you know, he gave the example of Leibniz, and how Leibniz was able to break away from the idea of the parabola when he was looking at, you know, what defines the rate of a changing rate of change in physical curves, like a hanging chain or a rope bridge, which looks like a parabola, but if you actually examine it, it is not a parabola. A parabola is not defined by forces of geometry, of gravity, of other things. So there's other things that involve cycloids that we were looking at last week. When you take a wheel and you roll a wheel and you trace the movement of one point on the wheel, it creates what one could say might also be like either a half oval or something, but it's not that either. It's created by physically rotating a wheel and generating a new type of curve, which will have these very interesting effects. Like if you roll a ball or a marble on such a curve, you will find that pathway that marble rolls down is the fastest of all possible pathways, faster than any other type of curve or even a straight line, which goes from point A to point B. It will be that, and it was called the brachistochrone. And we looked at some videos last week of these things, which again opens up the door to a lot of discoveries. And people like Carl Gauss, Riemann were doing that. So what LaRouche has been trying to get at is that to think about economics, you have to think about, before you think about the money, you're thinking about the system as a system, meaning all of the means of production and consumption and everything in between that goes into both maintaining a system in any given nation and how it changes either for the better or for the worse, how it decays or gets better through the advent of new discoveries and technologies that either are cultivated and applied or are sabotaged based on, you know, there's a variety of ways to sabotage good discoveries to either happen, or if they happen, there's no guarantee that they're going to be translated into new inventions, or they won't necessarily benefit the society if you have like an oligarchy sabotaging good ideas. So the metaphor of seeing an economy kind of like different types of economies, maybe in different nations, you could imagine them metaphorically as likened to a heat-powered machine. and two machines might be designed to have a similar effect, but based upon their design, and maybe one is a bit more incompetent or lacks some understanding of the universe that the other one has, one machine will function better, whether a Porsche engine versus a Volkswagen engine or something. It's two engines that are designed to get a similar effect, but one is going to get much better results when applied to action. I don't know if that's the best example, but we could sort of think about the space-time of like a society that's reliant upon slave labor that is relatively stagnant, that is not moving in a creative way, because all of the wealth is reliant upon, producing cash cropping cotton and nothing else, versus a society which has a full spectrum economy, right? Which there's a bigger division of labor, a lot of different means of people discovering their talents, because there's so many other new opportunities to express yourself, even artistically, versus the slave society, that can only do one thing, like be a master or a slave. So it's you could think of that as like a different space-time in the sense that all of the cycles of production are on a different frequency, right, in one system than in another one. And you could then judge the better or worseness, a moral value. You could look for the moral values that define that too, which a lot of people say you can't do because it's all about the money. And maybe two systems make the same amount of money at a certain time, but there's something qualitatively absent in one that is there in the other one, So that's stuff to just hold in mind when you read some of the more complicated words that LaRouche is using, that might seem a bit intimidating when talking about economics, but it's grounded. But I don't know if there's any other thoughts or questions people had in some of what we were looking at, or should we just read?
Just before we go on, I just want to let you know that explanation was very helpful for me. Thank you.
Oh, no problem. Thanks.
Ditto.
Cool.
A lot of what we talked about last week too was couched in philosophy as much as anything else, and analogous thinking between things like Kepler's harmony of the spheres and music, tying it in to the harmony of music and stuff. So
right,
it's a pity it got lost, Matthew. That would have been a fun one for people to watch.
Yeah, I know, it's sad. It's okay. It's all right. I mean, we can do it again. No, we're not going to do it again. But the pages are the previous 4 pages basically. So anybody who wants to get that, they can just reread that, and I'm sure they'll have a lot of good ideas that are awoke.
All right, proceeding.
Sure.
For example, from its beginnings as English-speaking colonies in North America, the welfare of that nation depended upon its sovereign access to the development of basic economic infrastructure, agriculture, and manufacturing, and technological progress in all of those categories. Among the related strategic features of the USA toward the close of the 18th century was the advantage represented by the fact that the average real income was more than twice that of the United Kingdom. The cultural standard of literacy of the American Latin farmer typified the fact that the literacy of the U.S. household was better than twice that of the United Kingdom. The relative strength and the interdependency of these kinds of essential sovereignty assets of the U.S. economy was a characteristic of the U.S. economy as a whole. This was a characteristic of the whole which was reflected as a characteristic of the activity within the parts of the whole. In former, saner times, not many decades ago, the prospective investor would locate the development of industries on the basis of studies of the characteristics of the labor force, basic economic infrastructure, and so forth of the localities compared, the level of education, and of technological aptitudes of the population generally, and labor force more narrowly, were among the prime considerations in choosing a location for the new plant. Among these considerations were transport of goods in and out of the locality, the quality of the local educational institutions, and geographical proximity to relevant categories of relevant suppliers and customers. In that practice, intelligent managements of either government or industry would be assessing the prospective performance of the individual enterprise within the terms of the relative economic characteristics of each locality considered. In assessing the potential for medium to long-term economic development in a so-called developing region of the world as a whole, the same considerations are to be applied in reverse. How should the potential of the population and of various regions be developed, that to the purpose of optimization, optimizing the rate of improvement of the economic characteristics of the national economy. What has tended to happen under recent decades' trends of exporting the productive capacity of the United States to poorer nations is that the U.S. interests involved have mimicked the approach which the Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, British, and French colonial powers took toward their colonies. Those powers were lustfully zealous in their zeal to extract from the colonies, but usually with more or less disastrous effects respecting the possible alternative goal of bringing those colonies as a whole up to the level of the characteristic productive potential of a modern European society. The referenced European colonial powers had a certain type of practice from the establishment of that form of colonialism beginning the late 15th and early 16th centuries. All were dominated by the influence of the imperialist maritime power of Venice, and most of the practice by Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, England, Britain, and France was either done in partnership with Venetian rentier financier interests or explicitly modeled upon Venetian precedents for this practice. The leading exception, but not the only exception, was the development of the English colonies in North America. Thus, if we identify the prevailing practice of colonialism initiated by the Portuguese, Spanish, Netherlands, British, and French interests as the Venetian or British model, we are not misleading anyone by stating that there are only two post-15th century models for development of colonial regions, the Venetian British and American types. By types, we mean paradigms, not necessarily always the practices to be observed in their relevant locality. In this comparison, the practice of slavery, first introduced by the Portuguese and Spanish colonialists, is a manifestation of the Venetian British type. The American paradigm is otherwise known as the American nation-building paradigm. This means that economic and related policies are aimed at achieving a healthy form of what is called a full-set economy. Full set should be taken to signify, among other things, that the economy is adapted to achieving and maintaining efficient technological parity with other nations generally, and aiming for parity in physical standard of living and relative productivity among the labor forces. By contrast, the British system, whose characteristic features were established under the direction of the British East India Company during the 18th century, is characterized by its design for a combination of colonialism with looting of nations through a system of international loans, similar to the looting of nations of Central and South America by the USA and others under the post-1971 floating exchange rate IMF system. The contrast between the two historically leading systems of the world during the past 2 centuries, the British system, loosely termed capitalism, and the opposing American system of political economy, is essentially the following.
Okay. Pretty straightforward so far. I was actually, just a quick side note, I'm about to publish an amazing article written by Andrew I forgot his name actually, Andrew something or other. He's participated in some of the readings, but it's on the Portuguese, and it really gets at how Portugal in the early to mid 19th century was becoming one of the fastest developing economies based upon the application of the American system in Portugal, which had, I mean, he goes through some statistics that showcase the rate of creation of engineers, students, industrial output, everything, which was becoming a real threat to the British Empire's interests because they want to keep everybody kind of backwards and dependent. And this author goes through how the British were able to orchestrate these insane wars between Portugal and all of its neighbors, which basically wiped out 2/5 of the male population above the age of 17 in Portugal in the course of that entire war, and total scorched earth, conscious destruction of all of the the industries, the manufacturing bases earned, like, won and built up by Portugal, all of it was consciously wiped out for no good reason, but just to keep them backwards, in a very similar way that we've seen applied to a lot of African nations and others who've been aspiring for, real economic progress that would allow them to stand on their own 2 feet. And they've seen their hard-won industries just wiped out under the IMF and World Bank for the past 50, 60 years. But
When was that war that did that to Portugal?
This guy Garcia, I'm learning this all for the first time. It's a big blank spot for me. I would say it was in the 1860s, 70s, was it? I'm not too sure now. I got to go back to that paper. But it'll be published by tonight. I'll share it. It's really, really astounding.
Nice.
Always did wonder what happened to Portugal.
Yeah, well, you're about to find out.
They were literally on top 1 minute, and then all of a sudden disappeared.
Yeah, and this guy, President Garcia, is treated like a quack by all of the mainstream, gatekeepers, for obvious reasons, because he was just such a powerful spirit with such a self-awareness of what he was doing. It's quite something.
All right.
So we got American versus British system. Bruce, you want to keep reading?
Sure. The American system is premised upon the principle of promotion of the general welfare and upon the so-called American patriotic intellectual tradition, which President Franklin Roosevelt largely defended and of which I am a leading spokesman today. It is aimed at that social and economic result in its domestic affairs and is inclined to promote what is termed today a multipolar configuration of power, a community of principle based upon the notion of the general welfare within and among the members of a system of perfectly sovereign nation-state republics. In service of the promotion of the general welfare, the American system is intrinsically protectionist. The British system is premised upon directly opposite fundamental principles, those of Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Bernard Mandeville, Adam Smith, Jeremy Bentham et al., as developed by the British East India Company's Halle-Berry school ideologues. It is based upon the predatory principle of conflict of each against all, and upon strictly predatory and hedonistic motivations on all accounts. It was, until recently, strictly protectionist in respect to its homeland market, but was the leading advocate of the predatory doctrine of free trade in matters of trade and international loans. U.S. circles which think and act in accord with the anti-American British model are known traditionally since the American struggle for independence, as by Franklin Roosevelt and by me, as American Tories. The function of free trade in world trade and in the matter of international loans is to force down the prices of other nations to the lowest and to pursue this policy as a way of ensuring their relative subjugation to the imperialist interests of the British system and its American Tory co-thinkers. Thus, the recent decades Anglo-American advocates of free trade and outsourcing have dumped upon so-called emerging markets the opportunity to produce, but only under terms, prices, and conditions which will efficiently prevent those markets from achieving the goals of their general welfare, and will enable the Anglo-American financier interests to loot those markets, at least for a time, more energetically and copiously in the process. The essential premise for a policy informed by the American intellectual tradition toward both other nations and our own is that, in fact, the relative cheapness and quality of the product we can attain through trade is important to all nations. These admirable qualities are not achieved by cruelly reducing the price of labor in the vendor nations, as current IMF conditionalities do, but by advancing the productive powers of labor through raising the standard of living and technological practice in the vendor nations. In other words, measure how much quality can be obtained from a vendor nation per average per capita hour of work by the labor force of that vendor nation. This depends upon our recognizing that the standard of living and technology in the vendor nation will determine that nation's ability to continue to offer us that result. The object is to increase the productive powers of labor of all nations, which cannot be anything but of mutual benefit to each and all. This is accomplished by raising the standard of living and productivity per capita and per square kilometer among each and all nations. Expressing the difference between these opposing roles of the American and British models, the British model assumes that the universe is a Hobbesian, Lockean nightmare ruled by a principle of universal entropy. In this universe, one man's gain can occur only as another man's loss. This was the assumption introduced to England by the English translation of the work of Venetian author Botero and by the Venetian Giamaria Ortez, whose English language translation was plagiarized by the British East India Company's Thomas Malthus. The contrary, American system, whose essential features were derived chiefly from the influence of the anti-Lockean Leibniz, recognizes the effect of man's cognitive action as intrinsically anti-entropic, as Benjamin Franklin's sometimes host Abraham Kastner, the teacher of Karl Gauss, did. In the American system, cognitive action generates the effects of anti-entropy. Trade among nations, which is premised upon sharing the fruits of cognition, contributes to both the importer and the exporter, more or less equally. The source of this anti-Malthusian gain is the fostering of the role of the educable, creative powers of the individual human mind. This is accomplished by such means as developing the cognitive powers of the individual, and by reshaping production to rely increasingly upon forms of economic activity which incorporate more advanced expressions of scientific and technological progress. My opposition, as an American patriot, to the generally taught loose-boweled use of the term capitalism should be registered again at this point. It should be sufficient to read the U.S. Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Federal Constitution of 1787 to 1789, the reports to the Congress by U.S. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, the defense of the American system by Matthew Carey, Friedrich List, Henry C. Carey, and Abraham Lincoln. Capitalism is used as the term was used by Karl Marx, who, according to a knowledgeable study of his writings, lacked any competent knowledge of U.S. history and the American system. The term is used in a similar way by not only Marx, but other admirers of the British system. That meaning is wholly antithetical to not only the American system, but the notion of the sovereign nation-state republic in general. Instead of using the misnomer capitalism, we should recognize the kind of division of labor between the state and private entrepreneurship described so aptly by Treasury Secretary Hamilton. Hamilton's celebrated report on the subject of manufacturers is the most relevant of early official U.S. documentation on this account. We should see that not merely as peculiarly the U.S. patriotic tradition, but as the implicit design of economy under any sovereign form of nation-state republic. Thus, from the American patriot standpoint, the flaw in the economic design of the Soviet system was the lack of efficient comprehension of the indispensable voluntarist role of entrepreneurship and of the proper role of government in preferring entrepreneurship to that implicitly oligopolist reign of financier-controlled large corporate organizations, which has looted and supplanted the U.S. entrepreneur since the 1901 assassination of President William McKinley.
All right, let's take a moment here for a word from President McKinley. This is a great quote. I love it. And by the way, you read with such dramatic zest. I love it. That's also great. Declan, you want to read the McKinley quote?
Yeah, sure. It's the one in the box. Okay.
That's the one in the box. Yeah.
All right. President William McKinley's assassination was a turning point in history against the Lincoln tradition and in favor of the British free trade system. In a speech at the University of Pennsylvania, McKinley denounced the mindset of the free traders. They say everything would be so cheap if we only had free trade. Well, everything would be cheap, and everybody would be cheap. I do not prize the word cheap. It is not a word of hope. It is not a word of comfort. It is not a word of cheer. It is not a word of inspiration. It is the badge of poverty. It is the signal of distress. And there is not a man in the audience, not a white-haired man, no, if he will let his memory go back, will not recall that when things were cheapest, they were the poorest. Cheap? Why, cheap merchandise means cheap men, and cheap men mean a cheap country. And that is not the kind of government our fathers founded, and it is not the kind their sons mean to maintain. If you want cheap things, go where you can get them. We want labor to be well paid. Wow,
Boom.
that was good.
Yeah.
Proceeding.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Nice, eh?
We've come
Yeah.
a long way since those times.
Mm.
All righty. Shall I?
As thou willst.
This distinction is made clearer by considering my own arguments on the subject of the most significant flaw internal to the non-military side of the Soviet economy as such. That is to say that the goal of modern economy, as since France's King Louis XI and England's Henry VII, has been to promote the freeing of the creative cognitive powers of the individual for the development of those innovative practices through which scientific progress is realized as technological progress in development of both the processes of production and designs of products. However, since the individual entrepreneur, as distinct from the public stockholders corporation, usually represents an enterprise employing between several and 100-odd employees, the entrepreneur cannot flourish in a natural way without extensive measures of protection, measures which can be supplied efficiently by no other agency but government. Thus, if we consider all of the costs of production of a product, the cost of producing the same average quality of product in a so-called developing nation is higher if all physical economic costs, including long-term ones, are considered. As we see in the history of European colonial practice prior to 1939, the apparent development of some local parts of the colony's economy came at the expense of the looting of other sectors of the colony. Consider, for example, the apparent development of a port city, as in the British colonial history of rural Bengal, in light of that city's non-functional or nearly non-functional relationship to the economy of the interior. The general lesson to be adduced from evidence of the type presented in the case of colonialism is that, once again, as in parts of the preceding discussion here, the value of the individual productive or related act lies in the relationship between the quality of the individual or local action considered and the characteristic of the national economy, for example, considered as a whole. This is typified by the role of the general forms of basic economic infrastructure in determining the characteristic potential of the nation or region in which the individuals. This is typified by the role of the general forms of basic economic infrastructure in determining the characteristic potential of the nation or region in which the individuals or other form of local action occurs. The relative productivity of a national economy lies not in the sum of its individual parts, but rather in the crucial relationship between the character of the individual or local action and the characteristic of the national economy or larger region considered as a whole. Thus, for example, when we permit the looting,
Yep.
when we permit that looting,
Yeah, you just go straight across, Bruce.
oh, I've been trained to wait for that scroll. Forgive me. When we permit the looting of a large region of the world, such as Central and South America since 1971 to 1982, or Sub-Saharan Africa, we lower the productive potential of regions such as North America and Western Europe. This points to the inherent idiocy of efforts to apply contemporary standard financial accounting practice to economies, and therefore the intrinsic, potentially criminal insanity of current monetarist theory in general. Developing nations should be given access to full set capabilities because they need those capabilities for both internal development and to acquire the means to participate in the world economy in an equitable way. However, the real cost of production is not cheaper in those nations, except as looting of them might appear to be so for some part of the population. The average of the total social cost, which is the real cost, is higher than in the industrially developed nation.
So far, so good, people? Or are there any
Yeah.
any thoughts or anything? Questions? It's good. Okay.
Those observations considered, to explore the role of ambiguity in a more thorough way, consider the import of Vernadsky's demonstration that when Vernadsky's proofs are viewed as situated from the standpoint of Riemannian differential geometry, the universe is composed of three distinct but interacting sets of universal physical principles, corresponding respectively to the domains of the abiotic, living processes, and cognition. The very existence of viable economies depends absolutely on ambiguities, which reflect the determining role of a set of principles which today's prevalent accounting practice implicitly denies to exist. The human cognition on whose actions the continued existence of economies depends absolutely. All competent economics focuses upon avoiding the common ignorance of human reason among most practicing economists today. On such and related accounts, there are sundry features to realizing such objectives, but one is of both overriding and underlying importance: the development of the per capita cognitive powers of each nation and of humanity as a whole. The nature of these relations is made clear only when we take the nature of physical economy cycle into account, as I have promised here. Turn to that matter now.
Yeah, this is a really great follow-up to the writing by Alexander Hamilton that we had read a couple of months back on the report on the subject of manufacturers, right? Because it's very clear that Hamilton is dealing with a very similar problem as what we're dealing with in our own world today too, which is one of dependency and a lack of economic sovereignty. And coming out of the American Revolution, the American people generally didn't have a lot of industry. They hadn't been allowed to develop their manufacturing because there were laws by the British Empire telling the Americans and all colonies that only the Brits would have the right to have the means of production of industry. So the US was stuck in an agrarian state. All of the colonies had to be kept backwards. And, you had little local warlords and local corrupt officials who were immensely wealthy who would oversee the Indian, slaves or the American system on behalf of their British overlords, but nobody could economically stand on their own 2 feet. So Alexander Hamilton's report really clearly made the argument why we need to have to give meaning to our political sovereignty. We need that to have protectionism, and we need to have the powers of producing machines, tools ourselves, and not be dependent upon some country that doesn't even mean us well on the other side of the ocean. And that way, all of the parts play a role in a whole. So your states that rely upon agriculture won't see an enemy in the states that have a little bit more industry, because they're synergistic, right? They're partners, because the farmers are going to be using farm tools and later on tractors that are produced in America by American factories that might be in a state that doesn't have a lot of farmland. But you have this reciprocity and a brotherhood. So the whole state is then getting better, more in harmony with itself. Whereas when you get in a situation of a consumer society like we've been in for 50 years, and you have now whole cosmopolitan metropolitan zones of Melbourne or Montreal or New York, which don't produce anything, it's just like a bunch of services economies. It's basically a society where the job market is based upon things that are not really productive. They don't appreciate that their food is coming from, Ohio or Idaho. They don't ask questions. They don't produce anything that the farmers need. And you have all of a sudden antagonism between the parts, right? And everyone becomes more dependent upon stuff from outside of their own part of the world. And increasingly also slave labor societies in Africa or South America or China that became just used for their cheap labor and not for their quality of life. They weren't developing on parity. So it's an interesting thing that Hamilton was dealing with, and FDR was dealing with, and JFK and us. It's the same thing. It's not qualitatively different.
Is this recording going to be available to the general public?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Oh, goody.
Yep. Yeah, and for those who might be listening online who are not familiar with Vernadsky, I'll put a link in the description box. We read two of Vernadsky's essays some months back, which we recorded, and LaRouche puts a lot of emphasis upon the importance of this Russian biogeochemist as providing a master key conceptually to understanding how to appreciate economic systems. And sure enough, when you read Vernadsky, who was like the president of the Russian Academy of Sciences, the founder of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, he was the founding father of Russian atomic science. Like, this guy was everywhere. And he was a lover of Abraham Lincoln. He had, the Lincoln portrait, or no, the George Washington portrait in his family home his whole life. You start getting a sense of just how the Russian and the American intellectual traditions that LaRouche is a part of are really on the same wavelength. It's the same. Yeah, it's quite something. So the next section is called the structure of cycles, which is probably going to redefine economic cycles in a way which is not taught in school. So would somebody else like to take the baton and read this section? We're doing really, really good for time today. It's usually we it takes like an hour to get through a page. This is good. Paul, you want to give it a shot?
Yeah, look, I've got a little bit of a cough, but I'll see how we go, okay?
Oh, well, if you had a cough, I don't know. We could do Jonathan. Or...
I just might need to do that once in a while, but no, other than that, I'm fine.
Okay.
All right, so B, the structure of cycles. That much said now, for this moment at hand, I focus the discussion on the elementary features of the functional definition and role of medium to long-term economic cycles. I include a focus on the aspect of cycles which, as I have just emphasized above, is presently not recognized within the financial accounting profession or related circles. The functional value of the individual's physical economic activity, as it must be assessed from the standpoint of the cyclical form of the national economic and international economic processes in which that activity is situated. From my first enterprise in forecasting, which took shape back during 1954 to 1957, I based my method for study of short to medium term processes on consideration of the medium term capital investment cycles inherent in certain post-1954 changes in national credit and related features of economic policy. The study of the methods of credit creation used for marketing of automobiles was a central, but yet only a pivotal feature of what emerged then as my pioneer venture in forecasting for national economies. I assessed the relevant individual manufacturing operatives, for example, as, on the one side, a participant in production, and on the other side, at the same time, the user of the product. The pivotal problem which I address by that approach is the counterproductive tendency to assess the role of the manufacturing operative, for example, from a reductionist cost accounting standpoint. The role of the individual's cognitive potential in the functioning of the process as a whole is either implicitly denied by such financial accounting practices or is relegated to discussions held apart from the general
Oh, sorry. Generality.
reality of the production process as a whole. One of the more striking indications of this during my 1955 studies of the problems of US automobile marketing was the not uncommon problem of the Coke bottle, or remains of a production operative sandwich within the walls, to so speak, of the automobile delivered to the retailer. Backtracking that phenomena showed that the efforts to design production and product according to such natural physiological characteristics of eye and limb movements were already being implicitly discarded, even long before the notorious 1970s, in the effort to squeeze point of production cost reductions out of the process. The cognitive factor in productivity was being squeezed out of the operative's role in production. It is useful to assess that kind of problem from the vantage point of the role of Auftragstaktik in German military training since Scharnhorst until recent decades.
That as far as I understand, simply means thinking on the ground, like expecting your soldiers to be able to problem solve on the terrain, which the general far removed from the battlefield can't possibly imagine what their soldiers are dealing with. So if you expect them to just obey a chain of command, regardless of reality, the way Churchill does when he just sends his troops, into Gallipoli to just like run head on into bullets, you're gonna kill a lot of people, right? Unnecessarily. And you don't believe in the creative powers of your soldiers.
Or Zelensky.
Or Zelensky. Yes. Good example. Somebody not using this technique. Yes.
Okay, continuing. The touch of excellence in tactical features of combat, as in production, is that cognitive something extra supplied by the subordinate leaders on the local ground to the purpose of making the adopted mission successful in ways which could not have been anticipated at the higher levels of the command. The crucial feature of production is the presence of a human being rather than a programmed robot at the point of production. Cognitive thinking, even about one's local place in the process of production, reaches outward as if by instinct to think of the product and its use from the vantage point of the economy as a whole. The thinking operative is concerned about the quality of basic economic infrastructure in that locality and recognizes the relationship of that to both the general conditions of life in that locality and also the enhancement of the net productivity in both quantity and quality of the product being shipped in and shipped from that locality. He or she tends to adopt the firm for which he works as his own and is concerned that the firm's product should be one deserving of pride. Similarly, he or she thinks of the real components of family income not as something he or she gets, but as something which our nation either produces or imports. Overemphasis on financial cost accounting blurs or even suffocates the cognitive impulse in the operative and others, and thus blurs the reality. That which we consume is an integral part of what we ourselves produce. That what we consume. Outsourcing is thus not only an affliction of the US unemployed, but also a grave moral problem for the US population as a whole. The sense of human identity of the present employee and the former employee discarded onto a scrap heap has been attacked with serious moral effects on the ability to produce. For example, by taking into account the known typical span of the product's useful life and including for US standard automobiles of that period, the role of the new car, used car resale cycle, an approximation of a pervasive production consumption cycle expressed at every local point in the economy was introduced. By comparing various important hardware, hard products with the case for automobile marketing, an interesting, accurate mid-1956 forecast of an early and deep 1957 recession popped out. A modest accomplishment, but a qualified novice's good first try at professional forecasting.
Okay, just quickly, I want to read this caption here. In his 1955 studies of U.S. automobile marketing, LaRouche noted the relevance of the not uncommon problem. Oh, right. Of the Coke bottle or remains of a production operative sandwich within the walls, so to speak, of the automobile delivered to the retailer. Here, the last car rolls off of a Ford assembly line in Mahwah, New Jersey in 1980, prior to the plant's closing. Okay.
Okay, most of published forecasts
By the way, just quick little side note. There's an automotive sector or a hollowed out automotive sector in Windsor that also had a Hershey's chocolate factory for a period. It used to be a hub in the 60s and 70s of productivity. It is now being retooled, and a lot of people are being rehired into the factories, which they're kind of happy about, but it's kind of, there's a bitter sweetness there because the factories that are now going into operation are retooling a lot of the sector to produce marijuana. So they're basically weed and weed associated gummy bears and other sorts of supplies that are now being produced to create jobs. So that's the type of industry that the Great Reset has in mind when they're talking about creating jobs and reindustrializing.
And gourmet grasshoppers.
And
Yes.
oh yeah, Toronto, right? We got or Ontario has the biggest grasshopper or cricket. Isn't the cricket consumable cricket company in the world?
I did not know that.
I think that's in Ontario too.
It's kind of sad.
Yeah, that's what I've read. Yeah, it's kind of sad wherever it is.
Yeah.
Okay, shall I continue? Most of published forecasts by notable others from that same period happened to be badly mistaken. I considered my own success only something better than standard economic analysis until I discovered how stubbornly wrong-headed most published forecasts continued to be over the same period into 1958. During later 1958 and 1959, my initial success of 1954 to 57 prompted me to attack a problem in long-range forecasting. What would be the challenge faced by the US economy as a whole should Arthur Burns' doctrines or their like be extended deep into the coming decade? By 1950,
LaRouche had, but for those who don't know, he made 9 major public forecasts using these scientific techniques of economic analysis that he talks about, which had come to pass, which is relatively it's interesting because he's not somebody who was trained in economics. He was working in the machine tool sector as a manager or a management consultant, but not really, he wasn't trained in economics. But yet that's one of the points that he will often refer to is to say, well, don't look at your diploma in a certain field to get somebody's sense of whether their opinions matter or not. Look at, well, what are their accomplishments? And his own are quite astounding. So this is just the first one where there was an economic recession that he was able to forecast. And then as he's going to get into a longer forecast that only manifested in the early 70s.
Okay, by 1959 to 60, at the same time that I developed a proof against MIT's Marvin Minsky et al., why the attempt to establish what is now called a new economy would be a disaster, I reached the following general conclusion about the US economy of the 1960s. If the US continued to follow the pattern implicit in the Arthur Burns policy syndrome, the second half of the 60s would be dominated by a series of international monetary crises, leading towards a breakdown of the existing Bretton Woods monetary agreements. I maintained that forecast throughout the 1960s, pointing to the 1967 sterling crisis, the January-March 1968 US monetary crisis, and the 1970 Penn Central Chrysler crisis, in turn, as typical expressions of the situation I had forecast as likely for the second half of the 1960s. Thus, with the mid-August 1971 breakup of the fixed exchange rate monetary system, I was the only economist on the visible public record whose forecast for the economy as a whole had held up over the course of the preceding decade. My interest during all of this was not to make a career as a forecaster. I was occupied with the development of the application of my discoveries of the 1948-52 interval to the existential problem building up for the US and world economies. The issue was how to design policies which would enable the United States and other nations to avoid the disastrous blunders of the US Truman administration, and also the types of errors which Burns' influence has embossed on the Eisenhower administration. As an associated effort, I included special attention to the axiomatic fallacies of assumption embedded in the doctrines generally accepted among notable Marxist economists. When I took up regular part-time teaching duties during the 1966-1973 interval, and my forecasts were publicised beginning that period as part of the work of my associates, my forecasts began to be circulated more and more widely, both inside and outside the USA, such that when the August 1971 breakup of the fixed exchange rate system occurred, my unique authority as a forecaster was widely recognised among relevant circles inside the USA and abroad. Among other circles, among the world's leading rentier-financier circles, my 1971 and later achievements on this account marked me as an exceptionally competent and therefore dangerous adversary, therefore a prime target for abuse and intended destruction. For reason of that 1956-1971 history, when I have written of my records as a forecaster, I have spoken of forecasts circulated during the recent 35 years with only occasional reference to the forecast publicised in restricted circles during the 1959-65 interval. From 1966 until recently, the limitation upon my published work on the subject of economic science was the lack of peers qualified to proceed beyond an introductory level of the principles of a science of physical economy. The combination of my successes as a forecaster, the attention they have received, and the severity of the presently onrushing world monetary, financial, and economic crises have recently created the circumstances under which a more intense and thorough study of my discoveries and their applications has occurred. With today's world crisis, the more sophisticated aspects of my thinking on these matters is, in point of fact, a matter of urgent importance for many nations, including my own.
Just
Here I
quick, for those wondering, the two footnotes were just references to three works that he did. So you wish to learn all about economics, the science of Christian economy that he wrote while he was in prison in 1991, and the economics of the noosphere. All of those things are worth owning. You can get them for free online on archive.org, I think, in all cases. And if you can get a hard copy on Amazon or Thrift Books or something, buy some copies of these things. They're really good reads.
What year was this piece we're reading written, please?
2002.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
Relatively late. Where did I?
Here I summarize.
Here I summarize, that's right. Here I summarize some of the conceptions which I have stated in the earlier part of this chapter. This time, I recast the argument from the standpoint of the crucial functional role of the individual person and activity within the production cycle as such. As I looked at the automobile industry cycle during 1954 to 57, what kinds of activity by individuals are necessary for the performance of the whole enterprise or national economy, and how is their relative value to be determined from that vantage point? I emphasized once again the point featured in the preceding section of this chapter. Kepler's method was based, as he insisted, upon his studies of the work of Nicholas of Cusa, Lucia Pacioli, and Leonardo da Vinci. Kepler also credits a like-minded contemporary, William Gilbert, who had made important contributions to the work of Kepler's new astronomy. That was also the method employed by the discoverer of the relativistic principle of quickest time, Pierre Fermat. The work of such followers of Kepler as Pascal, Huygens, Leibniz, Jean Bernoulli, and such followers as Leibniz as Kastner, Gauss, and Riemann. The same methodological approach must be taken in study of the underlying cyclical determination of both the overall and internal behavior of economic processes.
All right. I got a sense. Yeah. So this is a juicy quote. Vince, are you able to read, or how's your eyesight? Or using a tiny little phone? Little tiny type. Oh, Jonathan or Quan can read too. It's okay. Oh, you're on mute. Everyone's on mute. Sorry. Yeah.
I
You want me
can,
to read it?
Oh wait, I think Dasha just did you want to read, Dasha?
yeah, I can read it.
Yeah, go for it. Too slow, Vincent. Haha. Gotta get the next one.
Der Magnet,
I can't read it.
1600. See Abraham Kastner Geschichte der Mathematik, 4-volume reprint edition was included. Forward by Joseph E. Hoffman, Hildesheim, New York, George Olms Verlag, 1970. Notably, Hoffman writes in
I'm
the
sure he's gonna. You could skip the German. I'm sure he's gonna do a translation. No, he doesn't do a translation. He just goes to the straight German. Okay, I don't know
But he-
German, so let's just skip that.
Hoffman's message is typical of the spirit of the fraudulent academic mythologies with which the modern positivists have saturated contemporary scientific miseducation. Kastner, born shortly after the 1716th death of his adopted intellectual predecessors, Leibniz was the central figure in the launching of that mid-18th century upsurge of classical German culture, whose role is indispensable today for understanding any of the greatest developments in classical culture and science in Europe, especially in Germany of that period. Kastner led the 18th century fight of Gotthold, Lessing, and Moses Mendelssohn to defend the ideas of both Leibniz and J.S. Bach against the Europe-wide network of reductionist salons organized by Paris-based Abbot Antonio Conti. He is most famous for his lifelong influence on his one-time student, Karl Gauss, with especially notable relevance for Gauss's treatments of the subject of biquadratic residues and the development of the notion of generalized curvature, which contributed crucially to the central achievements of Gauss's most important protege and successor, Riemann. Euler, D'Alembert, Lagrange, and Laplace are notable as the avowed enemies of the tradition of Pusa, Leonardo da Vinci, Kepler, Leibniz, and later of the work of Fresnel, Ampere, Dirichlet, Alexander von Humboldt, Gauss, Wilhelm Weber, and Riemann. Hoffman's praise of Euler et al. In what is typical of allegedly scholarly falsification of the work and character of the universal genius Kastner is but one more example of the pathetic dishonesty pervading the intellectual life of 20th century science in particular and academia in general.
Hey, tell it like it is.
Right.
Amen. Yeah, and as you can see, a lot of this is sort of like a guide. I think what LaRouche probably has in his mind is he wants to try to inspire a curriculum. You can really imagine constructing an entire university curriculum around a lot of just a simple paragraph in some cases of what he outlines could be unpacked and unpacked to shape, I think, a classical, healthy way of teaching a student from, grade 1 until graduation of university, if it's done right. And that's, yeah. And certainly when you read the writings of people like Kepler, I could testify to this, having gone through a bit of this experience. Sure enough, Kepler is incredibly readable. His original writings, though they were only made available like 400 years after he died in the English language, they were very, very hard to come by. I think it was only 1991 that his Harmonies of the Worlds were first translated into English, whereas like Isaac Newton had like 28 different editions by the second year of after he published the first of the Principia. But so when you read Kepler's original writings, he's writing for both specialists as well as laymen. Like there's an accessibility, and he doesn't expect, even though he's making groundbreaking discoveries, he's not using a ton of mathematical jargon. He's really is appreciating the mind of the reader, and he's really going out of his way to try to tell people what inspired or shaped his thinking such that he could do what he does. And if you read the Mysterium Cosmographicum, where he first lays out his concept of the nested polyhedra of the 5 Platonic solids and the proportions when you nest them in a lawful way inside of spheres, he cites in the opening remarks his readings of Cusa and of Da Vinci and Luca Pacioli, who did work on the divine proportion. And you know, he really is sensitive to that. It's beautiful. And this is like not just a theory that somebody's just cracking out there, just like farting, you know, and just farting into academia. He's like generating universal laws that are applied and they work. So it's not just a theory. It's like there's something to his idea of the musicality of the orbits of the planets around the sun that are tied to these Platonic concepts, which is something you could imagine. It's understandable why an oligarchy would want to obscure the reality of those concepts, right? And how they originate and what their effects are.
And what they imply in terms of all the potential of all creativity.
Oh, big time. Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Wait, so Newton was their guy? That's why they published his work so much, like translated it?
Yeah, Newton and John Locke were both very high-level operatives in the real world for the British Empire. John Locke was a director of the British Royal Africa Company that infused like all of the problems of slavery in the Americas. Really were most plagued by the British Royal Africa Company that oversaw 8 million slaves infused into the American colonies from Africa. And John Locke was like openly organizing that, and he worked closely with Newton. And Newton was the master of the mint of the Bank of England for 20 plus years, overseeing like a lot of fraud. Like he was in reality, he was a high level player, probably advanced autist too, and had handlers. He wasn't his own man.
And we use his formulas in school.
Well, here's the irony. Yes and no, because his formulas were really just, you could find the source of the formulas we attribute to him as actually having occurred in previous to him by people like Leibniz or Kepler or Huygens or Flamsteed or there's a whole slew of great scientists who made discoveries, and you could directly find the roots of how these were co-opted and repackaged under Newton. So it's not like his formulas are not true. A lot of the formulas are true. And in the case of Leibniz, who they say, you know, also discovered the calculus with Newton is the big story. Nobody uses the Newton notation today. Like nobody uses his fluxion useless notation of infinite series. Everybody uses the Leibniz notation if they want to do anything. So it has no practical use. So in that sense, it's you don't want to assume that the formulas themselves that are attributed to Newton are not true, but they're true because if they are true, it's because they came from other people. And there is a you know, anyway, it's a whole thing. Yeah. But no, Newton is not such a great guy. No.
So they start the brainwashing right when you're in school, and when it's not even about politics, it's just about physics even. Scary stuff.
Which is ironically very political. Yeah. Yeah, physics is political because ideas have weight in that sense.
Well, this is anyways.
Well, yeah. Well, culture comes first and politics second. So, and it has been well analyzed by someone like Antonio Gramsci, for example, the theory of cultural hegemony. If you brainwash people first in school, you don't need to do much afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Or what did Bertrand Russell say? If you get the subject before the age of 10, you can have your way with them. But if you wait too long and you miss that tender moment where you didn't brainwash them before they were 10, it becomes really difficult to do anything with your victims.
Don't the Jesuits say that they can do that job in 7 years?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes,
That's what
exactly.
That's what Bruce Lipton contends in all his work, especially in the biology of belief, that
Yeah.
we're in that super learning state from birth till around 7, and we ingest instantly conclusions and patterns that now run us the rest of our lives. It's all subconscious, and recognizing them and
Mhm.
healing ourselves just takes a lifetime.
Well, it's amazing, like, because there's so much humility and awe and wonder at those young ages when you don't think you know things you don't know. So the rate of absorption is great and the neuroplasticity is super high, but how much good, right? If you have like a loving, tender, caring, healthy educational experience and cultural experience around such a kid, my God, like you could imagine, geniuses being actualized so quickly. And if you don't, yeah, it's hard to rewire. It's hard to repattern yourself after that. It's doable. Anyone can. I mean, I don't think that they say neuroplasticity ends like at 40 or something, but I think that that's bunk. They discovered you could create neurons until the day you die. Your brain is always generative. It's just it takes more work.
Oh, yes. Well, the theory that you don't produce neurons after a certain age has been debunked since the 1990s.
Right.
So it's a 30 years old fake idea.
Yeah.
Not generally well known as a fake idea, sadly.
Why, sadly, that's it, a fake idea.
No, he's saying
No,
not enough people appreciate that was disproven.
Know about it.
Oh, yes, that's true. Unhappily, this fake idea is still in circulation. Yes.
Yeah.
But why is it harder to like learn stuff, or I don't know, break your old patterns when you're older then?
I think you just said it with the last sentence, breaking old patterns. That's the hardest part.
Exactly.
No? But why is that hard?
No, but you have to conquer your own memories, and old memories are very powerful.
Hmm.
And as are patterns of behavior, especially
Yes, exactly.
for a long time.
Yes.
I mean, think of, a very simple one here. I mean, and very colloquial. If we talk about, people who are awake and people who are not awake, the normies, et cetera, et cetera. If you're confronted with a complete 180, degree turnaround in terms of your understanding of the way in which the world works, that can be, and you've had a way of looking at the world for, let's say, 50, 60 years. From then until, whenever you might pass on, the process of trying to come to grips with that reality and understand the new one even better is going to suffer a little bit by the fact that you had so many years thinking the other way. It's not that easy to turn it right around and to start learning again, and at a fast rate. Not impossible, but not easy.
Well, you've just
At least that's been my experience.
You've well described cognitive dissonance, and the mind shuts down.
Exactly. I mean, it's not easy necessarily, if you are in that situation, to turn it around quickly. There can be a lot of confusion. I mean, number one, you've got to then start organizing your thinking in terms of, where do I go for truthful, reliable information if the information that's being fed to me from mainstream, from family, from friends, all of these institutions over a lifetime is not reliable information anymore? Where do you go? How do you start making choices as to where you're going to invest your time and effort to come to a better understanding of the new reality through, both your efforts and through the eyes of the people that you interact with?
And Dasha, to your question, why is it harder as we're older? It's because such a 180-degree opposition of very compelling evidence that calls into question beliefs and habits that one has had for a lifetime is an existential threat. It actually can threaten one's identity. And there's a kind of panic that shuts the mind down. And this is well developed in the trauma-based mind control, that whole world. And
Yeah.
I argue that so much of American culture specific, and I'm sure in the other developed nations, the school experience and the culture and the media and the pride, what they want is focused on, I think is a perpetual and constant bombardment of a lot of trauma-based mind control tactics to keep us just addled. There's no other word.
I can't come up with the entire quote, but one of the best I've ever heard is George Carlin's description
What's that?
of workers. You know, that they don't want a citizenry of informed citizenry. They want workers just smart enough to run the machine.
Oh,
Yep.
yeah.
Yep.
Can I ask, but what kind of trauma-based control do they use in the school?
In my humble, school is a crime against humanity. To lock up children inside when children learn naturally, my study and observation of human history. So right there, you take a child at the youngest age possible away from the loving adults who would, you know, look in their face and help and talk to them and sing to them and talk to them and carry them as they work. It's a completely inhuman experience to do that, to lock children up and not let them interact with life. This is my model. Kids can't fall in love with life if they can't handle it. We're not allowed to handle life. We're not allowed to see people work, allowed to see animals play in nature. So there's the advantage of the indigenous and the native cultures versus the nightmarish modern societies that we've experienced over the last 100 or so years.
It's not just the indigenous and natives too, because my childhood was very, very much along those lines. So 50s, 60s, early 70s, Melbourne, Victoria, Australia, free range. You know, as a kid getting out there in nature, there was plenty of it around. You know, lizards, frogs, goodness knows what. You know, I had pet tadpoles and warts on my hands as a result. It was possible to, you know, live on the fringe of the city of Melbourne, if you like, the outer eastern suburbs, and interact, you know, with nature all of the time.
Yeah.
No longer there. It's all, you know, fully suburbanized now. But when I was a kid, it was a great way to grow up.
Yeah,
Playing in the drains, for goodness sake. You know, swimming in the local lake, whatever it was, you know, with the ducks and the fish and, you know, whatever, you know, and building an immune system, let's hope.
But that wasn't part of your school system. That was part of your cultural, like your environment, right? Or are you saying?
Yeah, but I mean, the school system, you know, we were allowed to learn outside.
Oh, okay.
We had a lot of classes outside as well as inside. I mean, you know, Melbourne's very seasonal, of course. So summer, spring, you're outside a lot of the time. Winter, autumn, you're inside most of the time.
I think I would just add the idea of trauma is not always necessarily the typical type of trauma, you know, like somebody's been beaten down and like shackled and told you can't fight back. Like that's very traumatic, or you've been through war. That's very traumatic. That'll create all sorts of, you know, that could create some serious psychological issues. But it's not always that. There's more subtle forms of trauma too. And I think you could, if we appreciate what the soul is in its healthy, creative, loving state, if that's our guideline, is the healthy soul that is, you know, used to leaning into the unknown, you know, that finds excitement making discoveries, that finds joy in the higher things like sharing new thoughts and helping others. If that's the sort of standard we're holding on to, then we could sort of see that, well, what we tend to be given as normal treatment in the educational institutions, and some are better than others. I don't know what things are like in your part of the world in Eastern Russia, but I could tell you, I don't think any part of the world is completely free of this. There is when you're told to say things you don't believe in, and you'll be rewarded for saying them, even if you haven't been, if you don't know why it's true, and you ask like, well, why is this formula true, or why is this true, teacher? If you're not given a reason and you're just told it's true because it's true, just pass the test and you know, cram it into your memory. I would say that that's a form of abuse as well. because the mind doesn't work that way. And the more you habituate yourself to learning things symbolically and being rewarded or punished for doing that well or not doing that well, it does create a subtle form of psychological wiring and trauma in a sense, just not your conventional sense, which becomes more and more difficult to break if you get too used to that, especially in university. And you start, like look at Sam Harris or a lot of these other, intellectual nihilists, or they seem to be very smart people, but their brains are actually, they've adapted to an unnatural environment mentally that they don't know how to think about morality or principles or truth. They just can't do it. It's not like they don't want to know the truth, but it's like I don't know what it's going to take for somebody on that level to break free and become and find their humanity. It's possible, but it's very hard,
I think that once again, Plato gave the answer if you read him carefully. It's the transition between number 3 and number 4, okay, pistis and dianoia, in the sense that there's a quality that is called the negative quality. I don't know if you know the expression. The negative quality is that capacity to live with uncertainty and to live with the fact that you don't understand everything. And it doesn't mean that you force yourself or you force someone in your environment to give you the definitive answer. And that is a very, very big quality in everyone exploring inner reality and outer reality, in the sense that it's okay. Sometimes I would say that we were speaking maybe 2 weeks ago about the metaphoric transfer, okay, in the creative process. Sometimes to be capable to ask the right question is much more difficult than to find the right answer or the right answers with an S. So the negative faculty is maybe something to be developed if we speak on a very practical level. For example, either a scientific question, a social question, a psychological question, a relation question, any type of questions, okay? Any type of issue of problems. Maybe something to be taught to children as young as maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 years old is to write questions. And writing those questions, you give to yourself the permission to think about those questions and not to force yourself to have an immediate answer. And well, that's, after all, that's the philosophical pathway, okay? That you learn to write the question, to wait for the answer, and to let things mature.
Yeah.
You just well described something related to this about what I say is an abomination about the school experience and how is it a trauma. You just alluded to curiosity, and I contend that by nature children are inherently curious, and that's how they are super learners. If we left them alone with their families and they could ask the bazillion infinite endless questions that they would ask every single day, people raised with that kind of safety and that kind of freedom rise to competence at a level that no, our social controllers will not tolerate. And that's just such an encouraging thing that is really dying out in the well-educated. It's destroying children's right to be free and to indulge curiosity so that they learn naturally and blossom and become who they are individually. It's a huge thing to examine.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that is so true. Like, as I kind of look back into my what's it called, elementary school, it was so bad. You are forced to sit in a classroom with 30 people, and you're supposed to stay silent when there's a boring ass lesson that you don't know why you're even learning it. And I used to talk with my table mate, and I got caught. And the teacher dragged me by my ear. She basically pulled me by my ear from my seat. And she was like, this girl is interrupting the class. Look at her. What she's doing? This is wrong. Can you stay silent and listen to the class? And I was like, okay, I'm sorry, but why do I have to listen to your class? And why are you touching me? So that's totally traumatic. That
is
but
literally traumatic. Yes. That's not cool. Declan, I saw you were gonna say something.
Oh yeah, I was kind of thinking about some of this as well. It was like, have any of you ever heard of the rock band Pink Floyd and their
Word.
song "Another Brick in the Wall"?
Sure.
It's and the music video that goes with that is just a perfect description of what the school system's like. The kids are on a conveyor belt and they're going through, and they're actually going to like a meat grinder or something. But it's a little bit of a creepy video, but it's really kind of true.
Cultural.
And they're and it's kind of the same way. Every kid is different, and to treat them the same is just stupid. So like my older sister, she read at 2. She was reading at 2. I didn't read until I was 9, and so I've been reading for less than 10 years. But in that time, within a few years of that, I was reading A Tale of Two Cities, and so you have it's how you, when you want to read, is the important part. Or when you want to learn something, you will learn it. You will have the drive to learn it, and you kind of sometimes have to let kids have that opportunity to actually want to,
Right.
and then it will become a pleasure and not a chore.
Yeah.
Einstein describes his relationship to his violin as being at first a painful relationship because his parents were sort of forcing him to learn the violin early on, and he just didn't have a love for it. And he described it. I wish I could remember the nuance, the details of his description, but it was very nice how he actually describes how at a certain point he changed his mindset and found a new way of thinking about it for the first time when he was, I think, maybe like 13 or 14, and he revisited it with that mindset of looking for the pleasure of the music. And for the first time, he describes how he found it after years of hating the violin because he was being forced to play it. And it sort of parallels what Helen Keller also describes too, right? How she also didn't, had no sense of hearing or sight. And she, when she finally awoke to ideas, I think when, finally after a few years of Anne Sullivan trying to like get her to read by just like typing in, letters into her hand, she finally got it with water. And all of a sudden, just like, it was this rush of discoveries, like everything just outpoured. And within a very short period of time, she was learning multiple languages. She was writing poetry. She wrote several books, like Helen Keller, she was teaching as well. So a lot of people even say that she was faking it because they're like, no one could go from like the age of 9 where you've never read or had an original thought. And then all of a sudden, by the time, you're 17, you're graduating from university and you're teaching and you can't use your hearing or your sight. There's no way. She's faking it. And it's no, they're in denial because she's proving that John Locke is wrong. Like, we're not blank slates. There's a whole way of teaching that her teacher, Anne Sullivan, had adopted, which is clearly Platonic, which had faith in her soul and her soul's ability to be awoke, not to be, not that she was this machine to be, programmed. It was a totally different philosophy of teaching, which works really damn well. And it seems like you just sort of tapped into your little inner Helen Keller at some point when you were 9 somehow by some miracle.
Yeah.
But Declan, you are homeschooled, I think so.
Yeah. Yes, I was. I've
Okay.
been homeschooled my entire life.
Yeah, because I was homeschooled too, between 0 and 12 years old.
Wow.
And one of the things that I discovered that at home with my cousins, there were no bad answers. Okay. When we were in the discussion about topics and so on, everyone gave his or her answer. And of course, the answer given has been developed and discussed, and not being a bad answer or a good answer. Okay. And in that sense, when a kid is not submitted to one of those subtle traumas precisely, having the good or the bad answer. I think it's very at the center of the bad public school, if you want.
Mm.
Well,
Yeah, I remember.
they're trying to sift and
That's true.
sort and reward those who can fall into line and obey really well, so that they can qualify for participation in hierarchies. And they
Mm.
develop the
Yeah.
mindset, Matthew, you described earlier. It's like it's rigid, and now they instinctually can pick up the signals of what's the right answer, what does my superior want to hear. That helps my whole elevation. It's anti-human, it's quite neurotic. And the final word about it, I'll say, is Dasha's experience as you described it. You think of the volcanic energy of children and having to stuff it in order to survive in the school environment. It drives us, I think, inside of ourselves, and it's a major contributor to the terrible neurosis and psychosis of generations of young people. And you look at it in today's reported depression, anxiety, and suicide, and drug abuse, and alcohol abuse, and the whole panoply of ailments, I think, comes from how we treat children, don't allow them freedom, and don't allow them to discover and explore themselves or the world in anything like a natural pace.
Yeah. Well, I would like to, maybe there's a thought experiment to do. Okay. Most of the people would not be homeschooled between 0 and 12 or 10. Would it be possible to put into the mind of a child in a very skillful manner that in school you are required to give the official answer, but don't presume that there is only that answer? I would say that it would help a lot of kids if there's a skillful way to put that understanding in their minds before they go to primary school, if they don't have the occasion to be homeschooled till 10 or 12.
Before they go into primary school.
Before, okay, because if
Yeah.
they have the occasion to be homeschooled, that's not a problem, okay? Because when I went to the public high school, I understood that there is an official answer, and that's okay to give the official answer, but don't be obsessed by the fact that it's the only answer, okay? But for a 12 years old kid, it's much more, especially if he has been homeschooled, that conclusion, he would get to it before going to high school, okay? But for most people who would not have the occasion to be homeschooled, how could we put that fundamental understanding into mind of a 5 years old kid before he goes to primary school, the public primary schools?
That is a good challenge, because it's needed. I mean,
Yeah, because we don't want to make the kid a hypocrite at 5 years old, you know? How to do it so he is not a hypocrite.
or at least can appreciate how your mind sometimes you might have to operate in an environment like that's the real life, right? We sometimes have to operate in an environment of the caves, like where people believe in conventions tied to shadows and not reality. And we can't just change that in a split second. You know, that's a gradual process. It takes many generations of effort and time. But to spiritually solidify the kid to appreciate how do you navigate in the world of shadows, and appreciate that sometimes you will have to maybe get certain answers on a test, or acknowledge that there's certain ideas that are in society, which was that
are officialized.
Yeah, but they're not necessarily true as well. Like,
no. Yeah, that's why I'm speaking of how to do it skillfully, because it's a question of words. Okay.
Yeah.
Because if you homeschool, you understand at the end of your 12 year when you are 12 years or 10, even 10 years old, that there are some official answers that are required by the society, and there's no harm to give it to please the teacher, but as long as you understand that there are other answers that you can create yourself. Okay, that is the nexus, if you want.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, you can say, your teacher liked a certain answer, that's okay, but but understand they are others,
Yeah.
but try to make it more skillful than what I just said.
Hmm.
Anything that could approximate what could happen in nature and homeschooling is really it. Minds are developed, I think, in two basic fundamental ways: conversation, and that's the. It can be tedious, but if you're a parent, if you've signed up to be a good parent, just a good enough parent, congratulations, you're going to have childish conversations with your child. But it is by that, it's by discussing things like Juan, you just described. Like, to discuss things is how you develop a mind.
Hmm.
And after 10,000 hours of conversation, there'll be 5 or 6 year olds that could run circles around a lot of well-educated adults who just went through school.
Hmm.
And then and after conversation, it's reading, because then you're interacting with the minds of presumably more intelligent and mature people than yourself. And you can get there. And I love the example of how fast we could rise to competence when we are so honored and allowed to converse with adults who care about the development of our mind. What a conscious intent to have. In the American Civil War, on both sides, North and South, there were a number of 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds who were put in command.
No,
Because
really?
back in that more free range environment, like Paul was describing, they rose to competence that quickly.
12,
That can't
13?
happen in school.
No. A 14-year-old person is an adult by biological definition.
Now,
And
maybe
if you
they
read,
weren't in.
yeah,
Go ahead. Yeah. Maybe they weren't maybe
you
in
had-
charge of.
go ahead.
I definitely remember reading about commanders of ships. Now, how many men did the 12-year-old command? Was it 10? Was it 15? I don't know, but I know there's more than one example. So Quan, yeah, make your point, yeah.
Wow.
No, many midshipmen in the 19th centuries, for example, they were 14 or 15. Okay, so they were young adults at those ages.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, Napoleon Bonaparte, he was a second lieutenant at 16. Let's not forget that.
Right.
Good point, Kwan. There were actually commissioned officers at being a teenager back then. Commissioned officers, yeah.
Exactly, and let's not forget that teenager is a contemporary concept. Okay, in the past, people passed directly from childhood to adulthood at
Right.
14.
Yeah,
That's a good point.
when they could do the job.
Yeah.
That's the whole
Exactly.
beauty of the whole apprentice model before the prison of school sucked all the young people into the prison of school. And as an apprentice, like, hey man, he runs my whole printing shop. How old is he? Yeah, 13. Okay. This is colonial. This is all that stuff. And this is such a takeaway from all your conversations and meetings that you lead, Matthew. It's you get down to the exploration of human potential, which is the potential of life and just the cosmos. Amen.
Amen. Yeah. Oh, that's.
I wanted to go back to what you were saying about Sam Harris a few minutes ago. Hasn't the idea of morality been conditioned out of him?
Pretty close, I would say. I mean, it might still be there in a tiny little whimper somewhere embedded under some layers of subconscious, maybe. Yeah, it's probably there somewhere, but yeah, it's been weeded out.
So the only real morality that someone like that has is that system that he has been taught, that he conformed himself to.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Quan, yeah,
I would like to answer yes to Susan to that question, because I have a hypothesis. All those people for me are spiritual offspring of Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche died around 1901, if I remember. So his influence has been present for the last century, more or less. Because let's not forget that one of the famous statement by Nietzsche was, God is dead, so everything is possible. Okay, So it was a tragedy because everything tragic after that statement, it's philosophically speaking because of him. And let's not forget that guy was medically mad. He probably got a sexually transmitted disease which affected his brain. And he was a brilliant man, intellectually speaking, but not having his own mind. I mean, the superior flaws of his mind.
Mm.
I seem to recall a very persuasive discussion about Nietzsche where the point was made. He was lamenting God is dead and we have killed him, and the kind of foreshadowing the crisis of the modern world since his time, because it was not only a unifying thing, but it did invite reverence for existence. And I'm not trying to dispute what you just said, Quan, about him, but it was a very intriguing insight that stayed with me.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I would say that, well, that's my own fantasy. He was not lucky enough to find a meditation master, because that was exactly what he needed. Okay, because he was a super intellectual. Okay, because if you read his books before he became mad, like The Origin of Greek Tragedy or things like that, it's obvious that he was super good, intellectually speaking. Okay, but he was on the verge of something that would have propelled him into the divine kingdom, if I use a Platonic terminology. And unhappily, he did not find the meditation master or the philosopher that would have been someone of the stature to guide him on the pathway to exit the cave.
Yeah, I got a sense that his intellectual fortitude and stamina and excitement, like just he had a power, like a really strong power. You could just see it bubbling, this yearning. It's really present. But he, it's sort of you get a sense of it too when you read Schiller. Schiller also has a very similar power. But it's I was speaking to a teacher who actually taught Nietzsche at Dawson College when I was working there, and she also loved Schiller too, and she made the point to me that if Nietzsche had spent more time trying to write poetry and explore his creative side, he would have probably found a channel or an outlet other than just remaining in his intellectual side. And I guess you could say thus big Zarathustra had a sort of poetic quality to it, but it really wasn't like drama. He didn't really develop that muscle, so he was too much in his own head.
Yeah.
Yeah,
but Matt, the tragedy is that if you read Also Sprach Zarathustra, it's almost a replica of the chapter 7 of the Republic. Okay, the allegory of the cave. Okay, the metaphors of the camel becoming a lion and the lion becoming a baby. Okay, the man of burden becoming the rebel, and the rebel becoming a baby, the symbol of creativity. That guy was on something, but I don't know why he did not manage to make the quantum leap, if you want.
I don't know.
Yeah, most of the stuff I ever read from him was the later period, and it just felt heavy all the way through.
Oh, you mean like the Antichrist stuff?
Yeah. It was
heavy.
Man and Superman and a few others as well. Well, parts of the entirety of the book, but parts of the parts that seem to be, they're the ones that float to the top of the memory when you think of the name.
Yeah.
Well, that's right. I remember that for a university thing, and it was so emotionally weary.
Dasha, why did you make a face after quantum leap? I'm curious.
Well, it just sounds super smart. It's like something really grandiose and everything. So that's why I put the smile on there.
Okay.
Well, I'm glad we've alluded to quantum physics here because Matt, at the beginning, when you gave the summary of the last Zoom, it brought to mind how exciting the potential implied by quantum physics has been for me for a number of years here. And also, as you've described the geometry throughout this, I made a note to ask you if you're aware of a physicist named Nassim Haramein.
I am.
Yeah.
I've watched his lectures, or many of his lectures. I
Yeah.
think there's interesting stuff, but I don't think he had the opportunity to rediscover a lot of the core ideas that LaRouche sort of is alluding to in terms of there's a lot of steps I think he skipped in his own development to come to the conclusions that he does about various geometries and their quantum relationships. I just see a lot of blank spots, a lot of leaps that I think are prematurely made in conclusions based on interesting evidence of things. If you know what I'm saying, I don't want to be too cryptic in my words here.
No, I follow
Yeah.
you. I
I'll step
follow
in
you.
because,
But Haramein reminds a little bit LaRouche, if I may say so, okay, because his findings are based on fundamental geometric quantization of space-time. And I'm not saying that they are exactly the same, okay, but LaRouche is also trying to bring people back to fundamental geometric quantization of space-time.
Correct. I agree. The objective is
Physical
similar and
physics and
there's
physical
parallels.
economy.
I agree
Yeah.
that there's parallels, and it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing that he's doing.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I don't know so much the work of Haramein, but what is good in LaRouche is that definitely he brings people back to physical reality.
Well, yeah, and Haramein is trying to get across the concept in a coherent way as much as he can of the coherence of the macro and the micro physics. That those are good things to do.
it's very much
Yeah,
focused.
but Bruce, I'm curious, Bruce. Do you find correlation between LaRouche and Haramein?
Yes, just as I heard Matt review everything so far, and inside my passion about the potential of existence in quantum physics is indulging the idea that consciousness is the foundation of reality, which is a spiritual empowerment of limitless proportions to me. And Haramein's speculations about consciousness, I don't know LaRouche so much at all. It's just so empowering. It's just, and it even, it ends up with how much I get out of the reports from people who've had near-death experiences, what lies on the other side. You know, I'm passionately curious about this thing called existence, and that gives so much hope, and it's consistent with all the quantum physics and ideas about consciousness that I've encountered. So here we are.
Okay. Okay,
Yeah, look,
Bruce. So you are ready for Yogacara Buddhism.
I'm ready for Buddhism.
For Yogacara Buddhism, because there are many schools. So what you had just said in the last 2 minutes, it's Vijnanavada Buddhism or Yogacara Buddhism. It's the same.
Thank you. I look forward to the playback so I can figure out how to spell those words.
Oh,
Yeah, spell that in the chat, Quan.
I'll
I will
jump,
write it in the chat.
I'll jump
Do
in.
it.
Over the years, I've spent a lot of time looking at Nassim Haramein, including doing the unified physics course that's available on his site. He is very much caught up with mathematics. You know, a lot of his work, I mean, the one that was most successful was an estimate of the proton mass or whatever, mass of the proton, which proved to be more accurate than, you know, anything so far. So there's a mathematical framework within which he's working, but he certainly does connect with other areas. I mean, even, you know, ancient history and ancient culture and things like that. he's as well known in that area. You know, he could sit on a conference table with Graham Hancock and hold his own, for example, in terms of the investigations that he's done there as well. An interesting character. I still find myself, his hollow fractal reference, if you like, provides a framework for so many other things to be possible. I mean, if you follow his mathematical proofs in that area, then Bruce Lipson makes sense at a certain level, Michael. Rupert Sheldrake makes sense at a certain level. All of these things are suddenly possible because there's a connecting tissue that Harriman identifies at the Planck level that has a geometric spinning field that enables, you know, essentially the creation of mass and everything else in the universe.
Yeah,
it's not the same, but it's not so dissimilar to some of the foundation, you know, cosmological foundation principles that you see in the electric universe theory.
Yeah, no, the electric universe is, yeah, definitely spearheading a lot of the. I think the closest thing we have to this trend that we've been reading about of real science in opposition to the pseudo oligarchical science that's not really science at all is probably to be found in the electric universe network. Yeah.
I don't regard Nassim Harameyn's idea as mutually exclusive, for example, compared to the EU theory. There are points of overlap all over the place there. You know, I mean, you know, the whole idea of a foundational connective tissue for a start, you know, that's a foundational aspect that they both have in common, albeit they approach it from a slightly different territory.
Yeah. I think overall, the issue that I guess I have is, as somebody alluded to, I forget who, this maybe over reliance upon a mathematical modality in the lines of construction of arguments and thought that I find doesn't resonate with me, that to put that much emphasis on the mathematical component. I always tend to resonate more for the physical geometric, like the geometric construction.
Experimental and observational, which is why I lean a little bit more to the EU theory, if you like.
Yeah.
What I really hear from Harameyn, or just gravitate toward for whatever reason, and no pun intended, is his description of, and this is found many places, how matter or energy blinks in and out of existence. So I'm so enamored by that, you know, at such a, you know, rate that we are a feedback to ultimate reality, and it's expressing itself as us, and we're blinking in and out of existence at such a phenomenally high rate that we experience a continuity, and that also is the room for free will. That's where our intentions, and this gets very metaphysical, it gets very almost, you know, what is our power of creation? How are we informing it? By our intentions and thoughts. Do they matter? It raises the question of the effectiveness of, you know, prayer, etc.
Does he believe in the existence of non-existence, or how does he think of that?
That's so specific. I wouldn't know how to answer that. I don't.
Okay, because when he says we like existence or matter resonates or blinks in and out of existence, you know, you're not familiar with how he thinks of the concepts.
Yeah, wait, but he's a classical quantum theorist on that matter, because let's not forget that emptiness in quantum theory is not really absence of reality, but rather a multipotentiality. So in that sense, he's not a nihilist.
Okay.
And I may have used the wrong way to phrase it, and he might completely disagree. Like, no, I don't think things blink out of existence. But
okay,
I know
there might be more richness in the behind the word. Yeah, right. I hear you.
Yeah, but many people would say blink out of inexistence by clumsiness, okay? Because what they meant in reality, that it comes from a multi-potential space. It's not the same, okay? Sometimes a spoken language can be very sloppy.
And my thinking as well.
All of us. I mean, no one has perfect crystallized thinking. It's and that's good.
Well,
thank God.
We discuss by spoken language. That's okay.
There's more little rabbit holes we could go down, Quan.
Yeah, sure.
I got a question. We had 2 paragraphs or maybe 3 paragraphs till we're done that section. Do we want to finish reading those 3 paragraphs? Or do you want to just like, that could be homework. We could do that as homework.
Yeah, okay, sure.
Homework. Okay, fine. All right.
Save my voice. Sorry, folks.
Good job.
I keep disappearing from view.
So we don't
Okay.
blink out of existence.
Yeah, very funny, Dasha. Very funny.
No, I'm seriously saying because I have no idea what happens after life. I mean, you probably have no idea what happens after life as well, I guess.
Unfortunately,
The folks.
I have theories.
Yeah.
Me
I'm
too,
sorry,
theories.
Bruce. Keep on.
It's the folks who've had near-death experiences, and there's only multiple thousands of them. And I've let enough wash over me. I have hope, Dasha. I have hope, and it frees me for as much as I can from the fear of death, which I'm enamored of. I'm enamored of that. And to conclude, to throw out a hero for folks to consider, President John F. Kennedy. I infer from his serenity how he struggled with his health problems his entire life. That man was on the verge of death his entire life. And he said to friends, the trick is to live each day as if it might be your last. Because for him, literally, that's how awful his health was. And think of the serenity with which we would say no to what offends us, to what's unacceptable, if we had no fear of death.
Mm.
And that,
Yeah, but for me, my grandma used to take me to church when I was 6, and from then on, I stopped going to church, and then she would tell me, oh, like, if you don't continue going to church and don't read the Bible, you will go to hell. And it kind of like was ingrained in my brain, even though right now I kind of suspect that I will not go to hell if I don't believe, or like if I just still believe, but don't go to church, okay? Because why would I go to church if I don't want to? And then burn for eternity.
Two things. Call in sick tomorrow and watch the interviews on YouTube on the Anthony Cheen production channel. Anthony Cheen, Chene production. He has multiple long form, really nice, thoughtful interviews with people who've had near death experiences. And they've come and they have described what that was like and the difference that it has made in their lives. Second thing, just a shameless plug for the book I wrote, which touches on so much we've discussed all night, and people can read about it at my website, brucedtorres.com. It's called God's School, 9/11 and JFK, the lies that are killing us and the truth that sets us free. I don't think I mentioned Pink Floyd in there, Declan, but maybe in the second edition.
Yeah.
Because I'm a fan. You mentioned them before, and I'm glad you did, because that's a great song and a great band.
Yeah. That's fun.
Thanks a lot for the recommendations.
Welcome.
Yeah, Bruce, I got to get you. I got to see if you would you like to do a class at some point for the Rising Tide Foundation?
It'd be an honor.
That'd be cool. All right, let's talk. I'm gonna call you about this after. On the issue of faith, I know myself. I went through a little bit of a roller coaster of faith, and I know when I was young, my mother is a Christian, and she was trying to, like, I didn't really have a very religious upbringing, but at a certain point she was like, she felt like she kind of screwed up, and she took me to church, and we were watching online televangelists too, but it wasn't a very good experience. Kind of like the school experience. I don't think anybody's really against school if it's done with love and done well, but we've all been through the corrupt, institutionalized, traumatic experience of it. So we know what the bad version of it is. And I was also introduced to a lot of fire and brimstone, shaming, guilt. There's people like, I don't know if you've heard of John Hagee, Benny Hinn. John Hagee was the worst, though. And I would watch some of these televangelists who basically were getting me, and I'm maybe 11, 12 years old, getting me to believe that if, every little thought I've had that was bad, I've thought bad thoughts. It's equivalent to sin. Sin is hell if you don't love Jesus and don't make him your personal Lord and Savior. And I just wasn't emotionally in that place. So for me, you know, I'm being told I'm going to burn in hell forever. A very visceral imagery that he's painting for me too in brimstone, and because I had these bad thoughts. And anyway, it wasn't really taught. I wasn't given a good experience. Let's just say that. And I remember losing sleep many nights of like freaking out, like, oh my God. And you can't really, your heart's not in a place of love, being ready to love Jesus or anybody if you're like in a state where you're constantly in terror, you know, that he's going to punish you if you don't love him. So that was not done well. So I kind of went again in a bit of a loop. I went into, you know, atheism. I was like, none of that could be true in my life. And I'm just talking about my personal experience. I've since then thought about questions of spirituality, of God, of my soul in more mature ways, and revisited some of these questions and realized that I threw out the baby with the bathwater in just sort of like running away from all of it. I was like, there couldn't be, you know, if that's not true, if that expression of Christianity isn't true, that I rejected, nothing. I was like, God, my soul, goodness, none of that could also be true. And I realized I went too far, and I had to revisit and redevelop a relationship with God, with my soul, with the good. And now, I mean, I could say that I do have a full faith, 100%, that my soul exists. It is eternal. It is immortal. It is made in the image of God. Like, these are things that I firmly believe in. It. I'm not saying everybody should believe that because I believe it, but that's where I'm at right now. And I see that when you listen to people like Martin Luther King Jr. or Lincoln, read his speeches, or John F. Kennedy, especially, or a lot of these wonderful people who just were able to leap outside of themselves and do these exceptionally wonderful, almost miraculous things throughout history. There's these exceptional people. You're like, they all tapped into that same source of awareness of their mindset being there. And that gave them a power that was exceptionally good, but we all have that power. It's like, they're not born special, but they've made a choice to move their mind and soul in a certain direction. And it really bears great results. It's quite something. And I don't want to be utilitarian about it. I don't want to be like, if you want to write great music, think like Bach, but kind of, yeah.
But I would say that they are people who are very capable to have a behavior and a representation of the world like they have a soul, but it's not linked to the idea of an afterlife. Okay, if you read the ancient philosophers, the Greeks, the Romans, most of them were not so adamant about an afterlife, or the afterlife of the Greeks and the Romans was not something so exciting. Okay, even the heroes, they goes to the Elysian fields, but the Elysian fields, according to the text, were not necessarily a very exciting place either. Okay, so it's more the idea of virtue and of fortitude when you're alive on this earth.
And these heroes also, to me, have in common a great, really unusual sense of themselves. I get the sense they're really being true to what they know to be their values of right and wrong, good and evil, and the fairness of wanting to literally do for and unto others as they would think is fair and due to oneself.
Exactly. And what I would call the heroic conception of the soul.
The what conception?
The conception of the hero of the soul.
The hero. The heroic.
Yeah, the hero. Yeah, heroical conception of the soul.
Amen. Amen.
A la Joseph Campbell.
It's a really good that you said, Matt, that it's more like a school, because for me, I just felt weird that I should listen to some guy who's preaching from either YouTube channel or a physical church, and I should listen to his interpretation, because there can be many. It can be just a God. Like, but Bible cannot, like, doesn't necessarily has to be literal. So and this led me to discover the science of hermeneutics, like different theories about Bible explanation. And I was like, oh wow, so it was okay to have different theories of what the Bible means. And it was okay to like actually think for yourself about Bible, and you're not gonna go to hell for it. So it was a big revelation. I was like, okay, fine, I'm not going to hell. And then I got kind of just like subsided.
Yeah,
Maybe
welcome to 1,000 years of Christianity.
Well, I mean, I think Saint
And then
Augustine, Saint Augustine is quite good. Because Augustine wrote sort of the first autobiography in his Confessions, and it's a really wonderful thing to read because he's somebody who you could really identify with. And you know, he lived his life in a sort of wayward way. His mom was a Christian. She wanted him to be Christian too, but you know, he was a Manichaean. He had other things, other concerns. He was more a bit of a hedonist, and he was lectured at. He found himself not. He was a very, very culturally developed person. You know, classically educated. He studied the Greeks. He could, you know, I mean, again, very, very cultured person. So he's very sophisticated. And whenever he would have somebody preaching at him who was of a lower intellectual caliber, he was like, this is not impressive. Why do you want me to change my identity because of these very low level, like these people had very not really thought philosophically about, you know, Jesus is speaking in very allegorical language. He's using metaphor, and it's a very poetic language that Jesus is using to communicate moral lessons, right? It's by definition, it's ambiguous and open for engaging the mind to think about. But if you just have people treating it like it's crystallized words and not appreciating the poetry, it dies. And then, you know, it's just behaviorism. It's like you're supposed to be good or else you're gonna whatever burn in hell or be rewarded with good karma points, and maybe, you know. And so it was only when he encountered St. Ambrose, who was somebody who, it was coming from love. Like he was a bishop, but he was somebody who wasn't in it for the wrong reasons. He loved the truth. He loved other people, and you could feel, and he was also sophisticated. He worked on his mind quite a bit, Ambrose. And so he was on a higher level intellectually than know-it-all Augustine, right? Who was kind of arrogant because he was like, I'm the smartest guy in the room anywhere I go. And then all of a sudden he encounters somebody who's actually smarter than him, but was also a Christian and was able to communicate with love. And what Augustine describes is it was Ambrose's fatherly spirit of love, which is what awoke his that's what touched him first and foremost. Before anything intellectual, it was just like, this person's coming at me from a different place. And it's the same thing for Helen Keller when she's talking about Anne Sullivan, her teacher. The first experience or the first idea that Helen Keller describes in her autobiography was that there's this other force outside of me that seems to love me. And she's like, that's the first idea she ever had. And she was maybe like 8 years old, right? The girl who was born deaf and blind. So it seems to be this. And I know for me, like any good teacher I've ever had, what made that teacher, the reason why the thing that won my respect was that they care about me. Like it's where it's coming from. It's the unspoken, the felt thoughts that was what touched me, and before anything that they logically said. So I think that's the big thing. There's just too few people who actually really love in that authentic way. In the church or in most religions nowadays, they're there, but there's very few. Just like there's very few people in the school system who like love truth when they teach kids. Very few. Same problem. And teaching is sacred, right? Schools should be sacred. There should be beautiful buildings. Should be like, but no, it's.
And
So what's that,
love
Declan?
is the very opposite of control.
Yeah.
Love brings freedom and growth, but control suppresses. I mean, for me, I was exposed to different parts of the church that, say that same thing. You need to have this personal relationship with Jesus Christ. But to actually expect to have a personal relationship, now you've gone off into woo-woo land, and that's dangerous. And so I got to know God a whole lot more outside of the church than in. And it really was love that drew me in. Perfect love casts out fear. And I was just bound by fear. But gradually I've come out of that, and now I'm growing. So Dasha, don't listen to those people.
No, I don't. I never did, but it's just played in the back of my mind,
Yeah, it's
to
one of those
this
nasty,
doubt.
nasty memories.
I
What's
had
that?
put a note
I can
in
see
the
Declan
chat. Oh,
has a
I'm
thought.
sorry.
I could see Declan has a thought.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about who God is and stuff like that. And so when you think of God, God is the creator. He created everything. And the concept of that is so big. What do you do with just that one thought? And so the only real action, the only real response to that is to worship God. And so I think the thing that's missing in church these days is that it's all preaching. There's no worship there. And it's one thing for somebody to tell you to have a relationship with Jesus, but you're just a person. How can you do that to somebody who created the universe? And so you have to have a structure. You have to have something there to help you worship. And as a Catholic, I believe that's what liturgy is. That's what going to church is about. It's not about hearing somebody talk. It's about worshiping God. And that is the most important thing you can do. If God exists, there's nothing else to do but worship him. And so that's what I think. And I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, it's
Going
more
to church,
process oriented instead of. Sorry, Paul, I cut you off there. What?
Going to church, in that sense, in the formal worships, is key aspects of Orthodox magic.
How
What?
so?
The idea of actually going somewhere formal and, at different times of the day and the night, so location on the planet, et cetera, and interacting as best you can through your mentality with, your worship of God is not so different to serious magicians performing a spell and going through a routine and doing it at certain times of the night and day and certain locations, et cetera, to interact with the physical reality around them. Different motivation, but same methodology.
Yeah,
same process.
Maybe, but I would say that there's that God being there makes it a big difference.
Makes it more effective. Yeah, sure.
And
exactly.
And there's a difference between just casting a spell and worshiping God.
Undoubtedly. But there's also in terms of the mythology.
Well,
I would say that it depends of the soul. I would say that worshiping God would be expressed in many ways depending of the specific soul. And some schools are more appropriate than others for a specific soul, precisely. And that is one of the big questions of human existence. Are you born in the right religion for you? Okay, you're born in a family, of course, okay? But that family has sometimes a religious tradition. Is that religious tradition appropriate for you? I think most of the time the answer is yes, but sometimes it's no.
But what do you mean? Like, do you mean like that somebody is born like into a Hindu household, whereas they would really only resonate if they were born into a Muslim household? Or what do you like? I don't get what you're.
That's my contention. Okay, because some people, I don't pretend to know all the religions in detail, but I have some general hypotheses. Okay. Certain religions like Islam, for example, are more for doers, okay? they have specific rituals. They pray 5 times a day. They have fasts. They have festivals. They have to respect. Okay? So I would say those. I don't say I'm not pretending that they don't have an inner life. They have an inner life, of course, but certain religions are more for doers. Other religions are more for thinkers or for meditators. Okay. Once again, I don't want to be a caricature. All religions have those layers. However, certain religions appear more for doers and other for thinkers and other for meditators. So if you are born in a specific family with a certain specific religious tradition or within a certain religious sphere, it might suit you. And I think it's most of the case, the answer is yes, but sometimes you have to explore by yourself to find the specific pathway to your form of religious expression. Okay. If you take the case of Augustine, for example, he was a powerful intellectual, but he was lucky enough to find St. Ambrose, okay, on his path, to impress him that after all, not although Christians were illiterate peasants, they are culture and refined people among them. Okay, because after all, the image of the Christians that he had before he met Ambrose, that most were more or less illiterate and not very refined. So since he was the most clever guy in the room, he could not be convinced by them till he met Ambrose. So sometimes the religion in which not made for times it's made for you, but it's not the right layer. You have to find a person giving you the right layer of that religion. For example, Matt, okay? The evangelists were not the right layer for you, okay? But you had to find someone like LaRouche, for example, who gave you the right layer of Christianity for you to accept it.
Well, definitely reading Augustine was a big one for me, and it was through Augustine, yeah, like I guess that I came to be able to appreciate what LaRouche was saying later on when I encountered LaRouche, and then from there I realized both of them were also Platonists and had deeply embedded the Platonic method into their hearts, and then I was like, oh, okay,
yes,
there's something more going on.
And I'm sure that everyone who had a soul before Jesus manifested their soul too, okay? Either by Plato or by other masters, it doesn't matter. That's what I mean by the specific way or the specific expression that would suit a specific soul.
I'm just loving this proof how common is the sense that there is a spiritual reality. I think that is proof of that, and I advise people to develop their spiritual imagination, and I have devolved to a couple of tips or tricks that seem appropriate here in this conversation. Number one is to pay attention to what causes what. This word or that we say changes and can have an effect on the people who are paying attention to us. It can change the effect we're having on ourselves, and also to pay attention to the coincidences and all that. If your goal is to develop your spiritual imagination, if such a thing is possible to someone who imagines that they don't have a spiritual imagination, you see how tricky it can get. And then it's the effect of all of our thoughts on ourselves. And then it's the ultimate, which is the advice, know thyself. Why do someone just wrote, have thy known self be true? Or they wrote that a little earlier. I didn't see that yet before. Why do I think what I think? How long have I thought that? Is it true? And Declan, I keep looking back at you as I'm describing all this, because I'm so much older than you and maybe more ponderous or verbose, but There's so much hope, folks, and you all share it and you all give it to me too with all your insights about all these things.
Oh gosh. No, definitely. Yeah. I mean, I think tapping into our inner child, right? Like what's the lesson that only the children will make it into the kingdom of heaven? I mean, I think that's
Oh, yeah.
something you even see that as a lesson in Confucian texts too, that only he who taps into their inner child. Kwan can find or probably knows the correct wording of that lesson, is the true superior man. Kwan, I don't know if you recollect that part of, I think it's Mencius.
Well, it's in both, but it's still the 2.6 paragraph, meaning that when you are at 70, you can do as you want, and your desire is in synchronicity with the laws of heaven. Okay, meaning you came back to the source.
Right.
You're like a chime. To use Jesus' word, you're like a chime, but you're not chime dish. Okay, because there is a difference of being chime dish and chime like, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Oh, I love
I
that.
feel great, Kwan, having just celebrated my 70th birthday.
Yeah.
Hey, you're now
absolutely.
at the official sage level. Congratulations.
Congratulations. Yes.
I can be as childlike as I like.
Yeah. Exactly.
Actually, look, it's interesting this business of the inner child, etc., etc. I mean, there's an experience I had in my 20s when I was involved with studying economics and politics, and I was on a studentship, so training to be a teacher. I had to go on a teaching round at one point, and I went to a primary school. Now, primary school would be from the age of 5 to 12. So there's a prep year and then 6 formal years of primary education, grade 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, I was there merely as an observer. I wasn't there to teach or anything like that. This was the first teaching round I'd ever been on. Sitting in the class of the second year kids, the creativity, the inner child, if you like, was simply everywhere in the room. I walked in and these kids asked me to sit on the chair of one of the kids who would normally be in the class but wasn't at school that day. And from the minute I sat down, the group at the table that I was sitting at treated me as if I was that kid. So they injected his personality into me, the adult sitting in the chair. And of course I had to adapt. If they asked me questions about what I was doing yesterday and where's my bloody homework and blah, 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 I had to adapt. But it was incredibly creative and a real fun time to spend interacting with young kids. That was the morning session. In the afternoon, you go to grade 4. And in that class, not one kid was willing to speak up or do anything unless they put their hand up and they were selected by the teacher to speak. All of that creativity that was there 2 levels below had just been so thoroughly extracted from them in terms of their school experience day to day. I mean, it was abrupt, it was confronting. And I mean, I went after school to a meeting in the staff room and I brought it up. I said, what did we kill? What is it about these kids in grade 2 that is just not there in grade 4? Oh, well, we have an obligation to prepare them for life in society. They have to learn to read, write, and deal with arithmetic first so that they can be economically competitive. That's our first duty. And I couldn't help but walk away from that one day thinking we lost something in that process. Yeah.
Dashra, I see your hand up.
Tragic.
Ironically, I see your hand up. The lesson was you should just jump right in, express your creativity.
Sorry, I just didn't want to interrupt accidentally.
No,
Someone
I just find it funny. It's fine.
A quick
Okay.
question for oh, sorry, Dasha, go ahead.
Boy, sorry. The cat is distracting me. Okay, sorry.
Oh, that's our little lion. Yeah.
I'll just get myself together. Anyway, so what you said about children will inherit heaven, it can basically be interpreted as heaven not necessarily something that comes after death, but heaven while we are alive. So as long as we like behave ourselves like children, we are inquisitive, we are like we don't have any, what's it called, preconditioned opinions or whatever. As long as we keep that spirit of not being afraid to fail, etc., just trying and learning as we go, then our life will not be a miserable hellhole like some
Yeah.
people's lives are.
Absolutely. Dasha, you need to move to the Black Sea because it was there that the ancient Greeks lived in Russia. Because what you just said correspond to what the ancient Greeks call acme, A-C-M-E. Okay, the acme for a Greek man was precisely that moment when he reached to that source, that fountainhead, that his soul, and he didn't need the idea that he would live after his physical body died, and he can manifest his soul on earth, and that precise moment. And for the ancient Greek, they hypothesized that for a normal man, that acme would happen around 35, 40 years old.
This is like so cool.
That's
So,
fun.
so you would have to move to the Black Sea, Dasha,
That was funny. Quan.
to be near your spiritual ancestors.
Stop.
That's funny. Quan. Acme, I always associated with the stuff Wile E. Coyote employed in stopping Roadrunner in the cartoon.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Same here,
too.
Declan. Same here.
That too.
Well, that's another meaning of acme, Declan.
Dasha, I also really like what you said about not being afraid of making mistakes. I mean, that was an important stage of freedom for me when I started literally telling myself, I give myself permission to make mistakes and to learn from them. So I had kind of, gotten that under my belt, that I was no longer afraid of making mistakes. But it's just been in listening to these lectures and like Matt bringing up that thing where he was trying to double the mass of the square.
Yeah, the area of the square.
Okay. And I finally am now taking hold of, not only do I have permission to make mistakes, but those mistakes are an important part of the process. I need to not throw them away and put them behind me, but I need to keep them and look at them because they're part of what's helping me learn.
Mm-hmm.
It may not have ended up with the right result, but there were some stages I went through right there that I needed.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an important part of the process. But that, once again, it's letting go of fear. These systems in the world have put us on such a performance treadmill.
Yeah.
And this whole thing about consciousness and just being, that's who we're supposed to be. And that's that childlike state, is to just be.
It's
Definitely.
almost tough to imagine a free, healthy, developing child in a culture like America, where children are captured and imprisoned until they reach full adult age. And I contend during those years, the major atrocity committed to children is preventing them from making decisions, certainly decisions that matter. Absent that, it explains the fear and the anxiety and the enfeeblement of 18-year-olds and 22-year-olds who come out of high school or come out of college, and they're absolutely overwhelmed and paralyzed, and they want to do what they spent their formative years doing, which is obeying the orders of somebody who's telling them what to do. And the fear is because we didn't use our judgment, we didn't develop our judgment. The last thing we want is to have to make a decision. And the other last thing we want is responsibility for anything, because we simply do not trust ourselves, because we did not make multiple thousands of decisions. So we learn to know, like, okay, and if I make a mistake, I'll survive. You have to do that a lot to get to that point.
Mhm.
Ever heard of WD-40? The stuff you put
That
on
helps.
the
That helps. That helps everything. That helps
it-
everything.
yeah, it's the
I have
oil you
no
put in
idea.
the
You have no idea, Declan, how much I have to use that stuff just to keep all the hardware on my drum kit from becoming rusty.
yeah. So do you
Never
know
known-
what
never known
why
so
it's
much-
called WD-40? Does
What-
anybody know
what-
why it's called WD-40?
No.
They do. No.
It is because it took the guy 40 tries to make the right formula for the oil, the water resistant part. So it's called
Really?
WD-40. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Honesty in advertising.
It makes everything better.
Yep.
Oh yeah, 1,000 uses.
Paul, when you were speaking earlier about education in your earlier times, in your time in your part of the world, was there corporal punishment in schools?
Yes.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, I got slapped on the wrist a couple of times with a strap, yeah, and a cane up the bum once or twice. Mostly for, you know, very trivial sorts of things. And I never actually saw it big time. There wasn't a lot of it. And I don't think I could say amongst, and you know, I was in a small enough school community so that you kind of knew everybody in your grade or the sister grade, you know, 6A, 6B. There was only about 50 kids at the school in total in your year. So you knew them all. I don't think I ever saw signs of anybody being traumatized
Right.
by corporal punishment. I mean, it was a rite of passage sometimes, you know, one of your mates would say at recess, oh, you're too chicken to get the cuts today. So just before the lunch bell or something like that, you'd make a point of disrupting the class and the teacher would bring you up the front and whack you on the hand, you know, and you turn to your mate and go, yeah, like, you know, I had the balls to do that, you know, you owe me your lunch.
Yeah, because my class was like the last time corporal punishment was still around in schools. Yeah, so it was never looked at as a negative, you know. It was just looked at as a discipline. I mean, West Indian culture is maybe a little extreme for you guys, but that's just the way we, yeah.
In my case, it was only at primary school that I saw that. It changed, you know, quite radically and quite quickly, so that the entirety of 6 years at secondary school, no.
Right.
Teachers
Oh, okay. No, we still had it till mid-secondary school, so that was the difference.
There were punishments, you know, staying in after school, you know, you had to go to detention. That was depriving you of playtime, if you like. That was a pretty, for an active kid like me, that was something I tried to avoid, that's for sure.
No, it's just that you guys had me thinking now. I mean, I always appreciated it as a form of discipline, but now listening to all this, maybe if we take it too far, corporal punishment too far, there's a possibility of damaging the urge for curiosity to learn, and then making the whole learning process at a young age much more difficult, you know. So I guess maybe there's a balance to strike there.
I'm sort of on the fence. In terms of like school, I don't think that should ever really, I don't think that should be a place in school. But as far as like the spanking debate, you know, like whether you should spank or not spank, I'm on the fence, because certainly I got spanked, but I didn't get spanked much. And I think my mom spanked responsibly, because that only happened like 3 times in my life. But I know that when I got them, I really deserved it. I know that. She didn't use them liberally. That being said, in hindsight, could it have been done otherwise? Could I have come to my my education, sorry, cattail, in a more responsible manner that didn't involve the spanking? Probably. Tough to say. I don't know.
Matt, I'm making a disclaimer. It from our West Indian culture, that is accepted and normal. You know, as I said, it mightn't be appreciated by other cultures, but it's understood. Well, like my generation and going back understood that, yeah, you do something wrong, your teacher beat you in school. And if the neighbor find out next door, well, you're getting licks there, and they will come and tell your parents, so they will beat you. So it's just, it's an accepted culture. It's not like if it's abuse or anything, it's just accepted. Well, you know, you do something wrong, well, you have to pay the price.
Jonathan, was it an effective deterrent?
I would say yes, because I was quite naughty, stubborn, how you'd say, yeah, and it did make, there was some deterrence there, yeah.
But then the question was, were you then behaving well because you learned to love being good, or were you just behaving well because you were afraid of the punishment? Like, what was your motive?
It would be a mix of the two, depending on the circumstance.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. As I said, that's just our West Indian culture. It's much gone on in the last 10 years, 15 years. Yeah, for the last 15 or so years, there's no corporal punishment in schools, but yeah.
Declan's dropping more classic rock in the chats. Have to say thanks.
We got there talking about my generation, baby.
Can I just
Talking about my
comment?
generation.
What's that, Dasha?
Can I just comment that at least 4 people have a whole library on their background? It's so interesting because I've never seen a library at someone's house. Wow.
I'd have to move my camera to show you, but my entire room is full of library, just not behind me.
Move your camera. Go ahead, move your camera.
Yeah, show us.
I don't know that I've got an awful lot of
Getting dizzy. Oh, there you
go. Libraries there, and there's libraries along the side here.
Wow.
I don't have a lot of lead on my camera, so I can't move it around too much. There's libraries over the corner as well, and there's libraries in the bedroom too.
Well, definitely, Jonathan has the most impressive books I've ever seen. Those are really
but it's for the wrong different reasons, Matt. Remember I told you, in case we ever get locked out or cyber attack or 1984 style, at least I have some books for reference of history and so forth. It's not really like I'm some intellectual. No. It's a backup in case things go south. You could still like do homeschooling or whatever. You have at least some sort of reference to the past. Yeah. Most of these books is before World War One, so it's a reference of history prior to World War One. So that is more like it.
Dude. Honestly, that's not a bad.
Yeah, but Jonathan, you're still a guardian of culture, so
yeah, it's a big responsibility, you know.
And it just looks cool as well.
And it looks damn cool.
Yeah.
All right, guys, this is nice. This is always nice. So, don't forget, we got our homework, which is the
philosophical discussion, man.
Oh man, this is soul food. What more can we want? So this is like I said, homework is just read up to the role of the historical individual in society, or something like that. If you guys want to read ahead, go for it. I mean, every time you go back to literature of this sort, you're gonna get something new out of it, and obviously reading it individually versus in a social process is a whole different dynamic. So go ahead if you want to. Either way, this Sunday we have at 4 p.m. The lecture won't be at 2, but at 4, and it's going to be Dave Gosselin. He's going to go through part 2 of his how would I call it? I guess liberation from Tavistokian hypnosis lecture. So that I'm sure is going to have a good discussion afterwards too. So I'll send the invite out, and then next week we'll just jump back into number 7 of this paper. So guys, thank you so much once again.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
See you.
Nice seeing everybody. Bye, y'all.